You will find, Michael said softly, measured, deliberate, that transparency is the foundation of responsibility. Every action has consequence. Every omission, every misrepresentation, is now subject to review and resolution. And I assure you, the interests at stake, my family, my son, the integrity of our household, will not be compromised. Vale's expression tightened, an involuntary gesture revealing the gravity of the situation. Michael observed it with clinical precision, recording each nuance, each tremor of discomfort, every subtle concession. The trap was not yet complete, but the initial stage had succeeded. Vale was engaged, aware, and vulnerable. Michael leaned back slightly, maintaining calm authority. Andrew, understand this, he continued. We are not acting impulsively or out of vengeance. We are acting to preserve integrity, protect what is innocent, and ensure accountability. This meeting is only the beginning. The evidence you have seen will be corroborated, verified, and fully documented. Your actions will be addressed, and the consequences, legal, ethical, and personal, will unfold accordingly. Vale exhaled slowly, an uneasy acknowledgment. I see, he said, voice low, uncertain. I understand what you're saying. Michael allowed himself a brief internal affirmation. The trap was active, the framework set. Every detail of the plan was executing as intended. There would be no surprises, no evasion, no circumvention. Every step was deliberate, every reaction anticipated, every outcome controlled. As the meeting concluded, Michael observed Vale leave, his posture slightly stooped, his confidence diminished, the psychological leverage now firmly in place. Michael returned to his office, methodically reviewing notes, consolidating documents, and preparing for the next phase. The initial confrontation was complete, the trap had been sprung, and the stage was set for consequences to unfold with precision. In the quiet of the late afternoon, Michael Turner allowed himself a moment of reflection. The storm of betrayal and deception had been transformed into a controlled, strategic operation. Every action, every detail, every interaction had been orchestrated for accountability and protection. Ethan remained safe, Beth had been engaged in corrective cooperation, and Vale's exposure was both inevitable and meticulously planned. Michael felt the weight of responsibility, tempered by the satisfaction of measured execution. The caged tension, the careful orchestration, and the deliberate application of evidence had transformed chaos into strategy. In that quiet moment, he understood the full power of planning, patience, and precision. Betrayal had been met with preparation, deception had been countered with clarity, consequences were now unavoidable. The trap was set, the pieces were in motion, and the next phase, revelation, accountability, and justice, would unfold exactly as designed. Michael Turner's resolve remained steadfast: protect the innocent, expose wrongdoing, and ensure that the consequences of betrayal were not only realized, but unavoidable, complete, and just. The following morning, Michael awoke early, the dawn light cutting across the Turner residence with a quiet persistence. The air was crisp, the suburban streets bathed in a golden haze, yet within the meticulous confines of Michael's mind, the calm was illusory. Every second carried weight, every detail was a potential advantage or liability. The trap he had laid for Andrew Vale was ready to unfold. Michael began the day reviewing every piece of evidence once more. Receipts, communications, documented meetings, and subtle behavioral inconsistencies, all meticulously cross-referenced and catalogued. The careful orchestration of timing, location, and observation would leave Vale exposed, with no room to maneuver. Each document was not merely proof, it was a lever of psychological pressure, a thread that, when tugged with precision, would unravel the carefully constructed web of deceit. Ethan's presence was a grounding force. The boy, unaware of the full extent of betrayal, moved through the morning routine with natural ease, his innocence intact. Michael watched from the kitchen doorway, noting the small gestures, the casual laughter, the fleeting smile. Protecting that innocence remained paramount. Nothing Michael did, no matter how strategic, could compromise the child's sense of security. By late morning, Michael arrived at the neutral office space, a nondescript yet carefully chosen venue designed for control. Vale was already present, a faintly self-assured air masking subtle tension. Michael observed the micro-expressions, the twitch of an eye, the slight constriction of a jaw, the subtle pause before a word. Each was noted, catalogued, and incorporated into the growing psychological map that guided Michael's strategy. "Andrew," Michael began, calm and deliberate, "thank you for joining me. I hope you understand the importance of addressing matters transparently and responsibly. There is no room for ambiguity when accountability is required." Vale nodded, attempting to maintain composure. "I understand, Michael. I'm here to cooperate." Michael allowed a measured pause, letting the silence amplify the weight of expectation. Then, deliberately, he presented a series of documents. Receipts, emails, photographs, each a precise instrument, calibrated to exert psychological pressure without overt confrontation. Vale's eyes flicked over them, confidence slowly eroding as the evidence became undeniable. "I believe these records clarify certain inconsistencies," Michael said, his tone steady, unwavering. "I trust you'll recognize the seriousness of the implications and understand the necessity of full transparency." Vale's hand trembled slightly as he shuffled papers, an involuntary signal that the trap was effective. Michael observed it with clinical precision, noting how controlled exposure to evidence could elicit both acknowledgment and anxiety. The leverage was now in place, the next steps would deepen the impact. Michael leaned forward, maintaining direct eye contact. "Andrew, the patterns here are not just indicative of oversight or error. They reveal intentional misrepresentation, strategic omissions, and actions that have consequences beyond personal discretion. These matters affect professional obligations, ethical responsibilities, and legal accountability." Vale swallowed hard, the veneer of confidence faltering. "Michael. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice low and controlled, betraying inner panic. "I didn't anticipate." Michael's gaze was steady, deliberate. "Anticipation is irrelevant to accountability. Facts are unalterable. Your response, however, can determine how consequences unfold. I am prepared to allow for acknowledgment, cooperation, and corrective action, but only if the process is transparent, deliberate, and immediate." Vale's eyes darted briefly to the documents, then back to Michael, searching for a lifeline. There was none. Every option had been anticipated, every potential evasion countered, every maneuver accounted for. Michael's trap was now active, the pieces set precisely for psychological and strategic impact. "You will find," Michael continued, calm yet commanding, "that this process is comprehensive. No detail has been omitted, no inconsistency overlooked. This is not personal revenge, it is structured accountability. The protection of what is innocent, particularly my son, dictates the terms. Everything else follows consequence." Vale exhaled slowly, a faint tremor betraying both fear and reluctant respect. I understand," he said finally, voice subdued. I see now. I cannot deny what is here." Michael allowed the silence to linger, amplifying the gravity. The trap had ensnared Vale, not through aggression, but through precision, clarity, and patient orchestration. Each detail, each document, each observation had contributed to the psychological leverage, compelling acknowledgment without the need for force. In the quiet that followed, Michael considered the broader implications. This confrontation was the culmination of careful planning, strategic foresight, and meticulous preparation. Every legal safeguard, every psychological lever, and every protective measure for Ethan had been thoughtfully applied. The outcome was now guided by consequence, evidence, and deliberate design, rather than emotion or impulse. Vale's subtle shifts in posture, fleeting gestures of hesitation, and controlled breathing confirmed the trap's success. Michael's plan relied on such indicators, psychological response as a measure of strategic efficacy. Each moment of acknowledgement, each sign of comprehension, reinforced the inevitability of accountability and the precision of execution. Michael's internal dialogue remained composed, analytical, and deliberate. There was no satisfaction in humiliation, the goal was accountability, correction, and protection. The trap had been set, the evidence undeniable, and the path forward unavoidable. Every subsequent action would follow the framework established, ensuring that consequence and justice aligned without collateral harm to the innocent. As the meeting concluded, Vale left the office, subdued, cautious, and visibly affected by the weight of documentation and strategy. Michael returned to his desk, methodically consolidating notes, reviewing legal considerations, and preparing for the next phase of implementation. The trap had been sprung, the first stage of consequence had begun. In the stillness of the afternoon, Michael reflected on the precision of planning, the careful orchestration of timing and environment, and the disciplined application of strategy. The storm of deception had been confronted, the trap had been set, and the mechanisms of accountability were now in motion. Ethan remained shielded, Beth engaged in corrective cooperation, and Vale had entered a controlled environment from which his options for evasion were minimal. Michael allowed himself a moment of calm satisfaction, tempered by the awareness of responsibility. The framework he had created was comprehensive, deliberate, and resilient. The caged tension, psychological leverage, and methodical application of evidence had transformed chaos into strategy. The trap was active, the consequences inevitable, and the next stages would unfold with clarity, precision, and integrity. By midweek, the tension that had been building reached a palpable intensity. Michael Turner's meticulous planning had not only ensnared Andrew Vale in the first phase of the trap but now allowed for a precise escalation. Every action, every observation, every document had been orchestrated to create an unassailable position of control and clarity. The culmination of strategy and preparation was approaching, and Michael knew the time for execution had come. The day began with a calm that belied the storm to follow. Michael reviewed the dossier once more, cross-referencing legal notes, photographs, and documented transactions. Every element was precise, leaving no gaps for ambiguity or misinterpretation. He then convened with his legal counsel, discussing the procedural steps to ensure that the forthcoming actions would be enforceable, defensible, and irreversible. Nothing was left to chance, the law and strategy were perfectly aligned. Michael's attention returned repeatedly to Ethan, his son, whose morning routine provided a grounding rhythm. The boy's innocence, untainted by the adult complexities around him, was a source of resolve. Protecting Ethan required that every confrontation be controlled, every exposure measured, and every step forward executed with deliberate care. There would be no emotional impulsivity, no reaction driven by vengeance. Only precision, protection, and accountability guided Michael's actions. By late morning, Michael was ready to escalate. Vale had been lured into a controlled meeting under the guise of routine business consultation. Now, with evidence fully compiled, legal frameworks established, and psychological leverage optimized, Michael was prepared to consolidate the trap. The meeting space, neutral, elegant, and deliberately controlled, was arranged to reinforce authority and limit Vale's options. As Vale arrived, he exuded the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to navigating high-stakes scenarios. Michael observed him closely, posture, gestures, facial micro-expressions. Even the slightest flinch or hesitation would be interpreted, catalogued, and strategically employed. Vale's awareness of prior scrutiny had introduced subtle tension, which now bordered on apprehension. Michael knew the first phase had shaken him, the second phase would cement the consequences. "Andrew," Michael began, voice calm, precise, deliberate, "thank you for joining me again. I trust you understand the importance of addressing these matters fully and responsibly. Transparency is no longer optional, it is a requirement dictated by fact, law, and consequence." Vale nodded, attempting calm, but his eyes betrayed subtle anxiety. "I understand, Michael. I'm ready to cooperate fully." Michael allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of words and silence amplify tension. Then, with deliberate composure, he presented a comprehensive collection of corroborating evidence. Photographs, recorded communications, bank records, and meticulously documented observations, all clearly illustrating patterns of misrepresentation, unethical conduct, and personal indiscretion. Vale's hand trembled slightly as he sifted through the materials. Michael noted each micro-expression, each involuntary shift. Psychological leverage had been established, Vale's confidence was waning, replaced by recognition of the inevitable consequences. The trap had evolved from subtle tension into overt clarity, forcing acknowledgment without coercion. "I believe you'll recognize," Michael said, voice steady and commanding, "that the evidence presented confirms actions and decisions that cannot be ignored. Accountability is no longer negotiable. Cooperation at this stage is both prudent and necessary." Vale's breathing was shallow, deliberate attempts at calm betraying anxiety. "Michael. I see now. I understand what's at stake," he admitted, voice low, restrained, yet undeniably influenced by the gravity of the moment. Michael's tone remained calm, deliberate, and authoritative. "Andrew, these are not matters of opinion. They are verifiable facts. The law, professional ethics, and personal accountability converge here. Your choices now determine the manner in which consequences are applied and mitigated. There is no ambiguity, no evasion, only responsibility." Vale's gaze shifted nervously between the documents and Michael. Every instinct to deflect or rationalize was neutralized by careful planning, strategic presentation, and the psychological weight of incontrovertible evidence. The trap was now fully engaged, there was no path to circumvent accountability. Michael leaned forward slightly, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "The next steps are straightforward: acknowledgment, corrective action, and legal compliance. Any deviation from this framework will be addressed fully by the measures already prepared. The protection of what is innocent, especially Ethan, guides every decision here. That principle is non-negotiable." Vale's voice was subdued, his posture increasingly constricted. I see. I understand the seriousness." Michael allowed a moment of silence to reinforce gravity, then outlined the procedural steps that would follow: formal documentation, legal filings, notifications to relevant parties, and oversight to ensure compliance. Every step had been anticipated, every variable accounted for, every potential obstruction neutralized. The culmination of strategy, legal precision, and psychological leverage was now in motion. As the meeting concluded, Vale departed subdued, constrained by awareness of the consequences, and carefully navigating the path laid before him. Michael returned to his office, reviewing notes, consolidating legal documentation, and preparing for follow-up actions. The trap had been fully set, the leverage secured. Every subsequent movement would proceed according to plan, reinforcing accountability and protecting the innocent. In the quiet of the late afternoon, Michael reflected on the precision of execution. The storm of betrayal, deception, and manipulation had been converted into a disciplined, strategic response. Every detail, every observation, every document had been applied with deliberate care. Ethan remained safe, Beth engaged in correction and documentation, and Vale had entered a fully controlled environment from which evasion was no longer possible. Michael felt the gravity of responsibility, tempered by satisfaction in meticulous execution. The orchestration of legal measures, psychological leverage, and strategic planning had transformed chaos into clarity. The trap was now fully engaged, the consequences of betrayal would unfold inexorably, guided by fact, law, and principle. The next stages, public accountability, resolution, and restoration, would proceed with deliberate certainty. As night fell over the Turner residence, Michael Turner allowed himself a brief acknowledgment of accomplishment, tempered by solemnity. The trap had been sprung, the framework for accountability had been established, and the storm of betrayal would be resolved through clarity, strategy, and justice. The calculated measures of consequence were now in motion, ensuring that the truth would prevail and the protection of what was innocent would remain uncompromised. Chapter 6, Judgment Day. The morning of the day Michael had come to think of as Judgment Day arrived with a deceptive serenity. Golden light filtered through the partially drawn blinds, casting long, quiet shadows across the Turner residence. From his office, Michael observed the subtle rhythms of the neighborhood, the occasional jogger, the distant hum of morning traffic, but beneath that mundane calm, a storm of consequence was about to unfold. Michael had risen earlier than usual, a cup of black coffee cooling slowly at his side, and spent the hours reviewing every document, every email, every photograph, every recorded observation. The meticulous preparation, the months of patient orchestration, all led to this day. Every decision, every step, every detail had been calibrated to ensure accountability, clarity, and justice. In the quiet of the morning, he found himself reflecting on the nature of consequence, on the fragile intersection of personal betrayal and professional ethics. Betrayal, he understood, was a virus, spreading quietly through assumptions, habits, and carelessness. It could corrode trust, shatter relationships, and distort judgment. The task before him was to confront that virus with precision, to neutralize its impact, and to protect what was innocent from contamination. Ethan, unaware of the full gravity of the situation, moved through the morning routine with a natural, unburdened ease. Michael watched him from the doorway, noting the casual gestures, the laughter, the simple joy of youth. Protecting that innocence had been, and would remain, the guiding principle of every action he undertook. There would be no compromises, no shortcuts, no indulgence in vengeance that could touch the boy. By mid-morning, Michael departed for the law offices and administrative buildings where the culmination of months of strategic preparation would take formal shape. The streets of the city, dotted with early commuters and the occasional street vendor, offered a contrasting backdrop of ordinary life to the extraordinary legal and personal orchestration unfolding within the Turner sphere. The meeting with Andrew Vale was scheduled as part of a series of legal and administrative proceedings designed to enforce accountability. Michael had ensured that the documentation, the evidence, and the corroboration from witnesses, investigators, and legal counsel were not merely sufficient, but overwhelming. Every item was cross-referenced, every discrepancy highlighted, and every procedural step meticulously planned. As Michael entered the law office, he allowed himself a quiet reflection. Months of tension, careful planning, and controlled psychological maneuvering had led to this day. The trap was sprung, the evidence laid bare, and the framework for accountability was fully operational. Now, it was the law, procedure, and undeniable fact that would carry the outcome. Michael's mind wandered briefly to the ethical dimension of the actions. Justice, he reflected, was not a matter of impulse or personal satisfaction. It was the measured alignment of truth, consequence, and protection. Andrew Vale had been ensnared by circumstance and design, not by rage or emotion. The unfolding events would reveal the natural consequences of choices and actions, leaving nothing to chance. The formal proceedings began with deliberate precision. Michael's legal counsel outlined the documentation, the procedural framework, and the anticipated sequence of events. Every piece of evidence was presented with clarity, corroborated by the private investigator's detailed reports. The combination of personal testimony, documentation, and recorded observations created a compelling and inescapable narrative. Michael observed Vale closely throughout the proceedings. His posture, his gaze, and the slight tremor in his hands betrayed an awareness of inevitability. The careful orchestration of prior meetings, psychological preparation, and evidentiary accumulation had created a situation from which evasion or denial was impossible. Vale's options were now reduced to acknowledgment, compliance, and corrective action. As the attorney for Michael spoke, outlining the extent of Vale's professional and personal transgressions, Michael felt a measured satisfaction, not the rush of vengeance, but the quiet acknowledgment that justice was being enacted with precision and integrity. The trap, patiently and meticulously constructed, was functioning exactly as intended. Each revelation, each confirmation of misrepresented actions, each demonstration of deliberate omission or ethical violation, built the case with undeniable clarity. Michael's mind catalogued the procedural outcomes, the psychological response of Vale, and the broader implications for protecting the Turner family and Ethan. Every detail reinforced the inevitability of consequence and the precision of his planning. At one point, Michael allowed himself a brief pause, reflecting inwardly on the interplay of human nature, consequence, and strategy. Betrayal, once hidden, had now been exposed, measured, and systematically addressed. The strategic patience, the deliberate orchestration, and the unwavering focus on protection had transformed potential chaos into controlled, enforceable outcome. Vale, seated across the table, now visibly constrained by both legal and psychological pressures, glanced at Michael. There was a subtle acknowledgment in the eyes, a recognition that the carefully constructed sequence of events had left no room for evasion. The consequences were unfolding exactly as intended, not through emotion or impulsivity, but through deliberate, patient, and precise action. Michael's thoughts briefly returned to Ethan. The boy's well-being had guided every decision, and every step taken had been measured to ensure that his life would remain as untouched as possible by the storm of adult consequence. Protecting innocence, ensuring clarity, and enforcing accountability were intertwined principles that had guided months of preparation. As the morning progressed, legal documentation, procedural review, and formalized acknowledgment of responsibility were completed with meticulous care. Michael observed each stage with a calm, analytical focus. The culmination of planning, psychological leverage, and strategic execution had produced an environment where truth, law, and consequence intersected seamlessly. By late morning, the framework of accountability was fully operational. Vale had acknowledged responsibility where appropriate, and the corrective mechanisms were now in place to enforce both legal and personal consequences. Michael allowed himself a quiet, reflective satisfaction, measured, controlled, and focused on protection rather than retribution. As the proceedings concluded, Michael felt the weight of responsibility, tempered by the satisfaction of careful execution. The trap, the strategic orchestration, and the deliberate application of evidence had transformed a situation of potential chaos and betrayal into one of controlled, enforceable consequence. The storm of deception had been met with preparation, precision, and unwavering focus on protecting the innocent. Michael returned home in the late afternoon, the streets of the city quieting as the daily rhythm continued. Ethan played in the yard, unaware of the gravity that had unfolded, his laughter and movement a reminder of the stakes that had guided every action. Michael allowed himself a brief internal acknowledgment: justice, accountability, and protection had been enacted without compromise. In the solitude of his study, Michael reflected on the delicate balance of patience, planning, and principle. The decisions made, the evidence compiled, and the psychological leverage applied had produced an outcome that was both inevitable and just. The process had been deliberate, precise, and unwavering in focus on the protection of the innocent and the enforcement of accountability. The day, though outwardly calm and ordinary, had carried the culmination of months of strategy, patience, and deliberate orchestration. Michael Turner had transformed betrayal and deception into a disciplined exercise of consequence, ensuring that justice would be enacted with clarity, precision, and ethical integrity. As evening settled over the Turner residence, Michael allowed himself a quiet acknowledgment of completion. Judgment had been administered, responsibility accepted, and the path forward secured. The storm, once imminent and threatening, had been transformed into a framework of accountability, protection, and measured resolution. By late afternoon, the repercussions of the morning's proceedings began to ripple outward, subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable. Michael Turner returned to his home, the weight of responsibility still pressing on his shoulders, though tempered by a deep, steady resolve. The sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets, a silent witness to the unfolding of consequences that had been carefully orchestrated for months. Inside the Turner residence, Ethan played in the yard, unaware of the intricate web of accountability that had just ensnared Andrew Vale. Michael watched him, noting the boy's carefree laughter and casual movements, a stark contrast to the gravity of adult conflict. Protecting that innocence had guided every decision, every confrontation, every meticulously crafted step. Nothing Michael did could compromise the child's sense of security, and yet every action had been deliberately executed to secure it. The phone rang, interrupting the quiet, and Michael answered with calm composure. The voice on the other end carried a tone of restrained urgency. confirmation that legal measures had been filed, that corporate oversight had been formally applied, and that Andrew Vale's professional and personal networks were now aware of the validated outcomes. Every element Michael had prepared, every document, every corroboration, had been recognized and accepted. The trap, fully sprung earlier in the day, was now manifesting in observable consequences. Michael allowed himself a moment to absorb the implications. The months of careful planning, the patient orchestration of psychological and legal leverage, had produced a clear, enforceable trajectory. Betrayal, once a hidden and corrosive force, had been transformed into a measurable, accountable process. Justice, as Michael defined it, was neither vengeful nor impulsive, it was deliberate, protective, and precise. In the kitchen, Michael placed a hand on the counter, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, grounding himself in the moment. He reflected on the delicate balance between consequence and mercy, accountability and restraint. The legal actions, while necessary, were but one layer, the psychological and social consequences, the recognition of error, the acknowledgment of wrongdoing, were equally integral. Andrew Vale, confronted by undeniable evidence and formalized consequence, was now navigating a reality constructed entirely by his own choices and omissions. A knock at the door signaled another development. It was the delivery of formal notices, legal documentation confirming the enforcement of professional consequences, corporate accountability, and regulatory review. Michael accepted them calmly, noting the methodical precision of the process. Each envelope, each document, represented both a step toward closure and a reinforcement of the deliberate strategy he had employed. He retreated to the study, spreading the documents across the desk with deliberate care. The visual affirmation of control, order, and strategic precision brought a quiet, internal satisfaction. This was not triumph in a traditional sense, but a measured acknowledgment that months of patience, observation, and meticulous preparation had culminated in tangible results. Every action, every calculation, every psychological and legal maneuver had executed as intended. Michael's thoughts inevitably returned to Ethan. The boy's safety and emotional stability had been the guiding principle in every confrontation, every strategic decision. By insulating him from the immediate turbulence, Michael ensured that innocence was preserved, that consequence did not become collateral damage, and that the lessons of accountability could unfold without compromising the child's sense of security. Later in the afternoon, a series of discreet communications confirmed the broader impact. Andrew Vale's professional reputation was compromised, corporate relationships reassessed, and legal oversight firmly established. The public narrative, while still controlled, was beginning to reflect the inevitable consequences of misrepresentation, deception, and ethical breaches. Michael observed these developments with a quiet intensity, noting both the external effectiveness and the internal satisfaction of procedural precision. Sitting back in his chair, Michael allowed a moment to reflect on the extraordinary interplay between human behavior, consequence, and strategy. Betrayal, hidden for so long, had been revealed, measured, and addressed with deliberate care. The orchestration of events, from psychological leverage to legal enforcement, demonstrated the power of patience, foresight, and methodical execution. Nothing was left to chance, everything unfolded according to the careful blueprint he had constructed. In the early evening, Michael prepared for the most personal aspect of the day, confronting the domestic reality of betrayal and its immediate social consequences. While legal and professional mechanisms had been engaged, the personal domain, the home, the family, and the intimate relationships affected, required measured navigation. Michael knew that confronting these realities demanded composure, clarity, and emotional intelligence. Beth, constrained by previous agreements and now aware of the public and private acknowledgment of consequence, had been notified and prepared. Michael's approach was deliberate: provide clarity, maintain authority, protect Ethan, and allow the social and psychological consequences to manifest naturally. The goal was not to humiliate, but to ensure recognition of error and accountability for actions. As Beth arrived home, Michael met her with calm authority. The documentation, evidence, and legal confirmations were presented in a structured, deliberate manner. Beth's reactions, shock, shame, acknowledgment, were noted and catalogued internally, each micro-expression a confirmation of psychological and social accountability. The storm, once looming and threatening, was now being navigated with controlled deliberation. Michael's internal dialogue remained composed, analytical, and reflective. The trap, fully sprung, had achieved its objectives: visibility of wrongdoing, enforceable consequence, and protection of the innocent. Every action, every observation, every step in psychological leverage and legal orchestration had been executed with precision. The outcome was now inevitable, tangible, and morally sound. By dusk, the Turner household reflected a cautious calm. Ethan, unburdened by adult awareness, continued his evening routines with the natural ease of youth. Michael observed quietly, a faint internal relief tempered by the awareness that accountability, justice, and protection had been successfully enacted. The storm of betrayal, deception, and ethical compromise had been transformed into a controlled, enforceable framework of consequence and reflection. Sitting in the quiet of the evening, Michael allowed himself a measured acknowledgment of satisfaction, not in retribution, but in the deliberate, disciplined execution of justice. The days of uncertainty, hidden betrayal, and corrosive deceit had culminated in clarity. Legal, social, and personal consequences were unfolding as anticipated, and the protection of innocence had been maintained throughout. Michael reflected on the delicate equilibrium achieved: justice without vengeance, consequence without chaos, and protection without compromise. The meticulous orchestration of events, psychological insight, and legal strategy had produced a resolution that was both inevitable and ethically sound. The day's judgment had been executed with precision, integrity, and a steadfast commitment to principle. As night settled over the Turner residence, Michael Turner allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Judgment had been enacted, responsibility had been acknowledged, and the path forward, while challenging and inevitably altered by the consequences, was now defined. The deliberate application of strategy, patience, and principle had transformed betrayal into a structured, enforceable reality, safeguarding what was innocent and ensuring that accountability prevailed. By evening, the weight of the day had settled like a quiet fog over the Turner residence. Michael Turner, seated in his study, allowed himself a moment of reflection, the culmination of months of patient orchestration finally tangible in both legal and personal terms. The events of the morning and afternoon had unfolded with a precision that was both satisfying and sobering, revealing the full consequences of betrayal and deception. Every element of planning, every calculated maneuver, had reached its endpoint. Andrew Vale had been held accountable, both professionally and personally, with no room left for ambiguity or evasion. Legal documents, corroborated evidence, and formal acknowledgment of responsibility had converged to create an environment in which the truth was undeniable, the consequences unavoidable. Michael's thoughts returned, inevitably, to Ethan. The boy remained unaware of the detailed orchestration that had protected him, preserved his innocence, and ensured his emotional stability. Michael felt a quiet relief, tempered by the knowledge that accountability had been applied without collateral damage. The preservation of the child's world had been paramount, guiding every decision, every meeting, every document, every subtle psychological intervention. The telephone rang, breaking the quiet. Michael answered calmly. On the line, representatives from corporate partners, legal authorities, and regulatory bodies confirmed the immediate impacts. Andrew Vale's professional reputation was compromised, his assets subject to scrutiny, and his future ventures now constrained by legal oversight. Every confirmation reinforced the precision of Michael's planning and the inevitability of the consequences already set in motion. As the conversation concluded, Michael allowed a pause, taking in the quiet of the home, the distant hum of evening traffic, and the subtle comfort of routine life proceeding unaffected by the storm that had just passed. This contrast, the normalcy of external life versus the intensity of orchestrated accountability, highlighted the delicate balance he had maintained throughout the process. Michael reviewed the day's sequence of events internally. The first meeting had applied psychological pressure with precise control, exposing both inconsistency and deceit. The second had expanded legal leverage, formalized consequence, and ensured that every action was accounted for and enforceable. Now, the day's conclusion offered a measure of internal, ethical satisfaction. Justice had been executed not by passion or revenge, but through disciplined, strategic application of principle. Beth's return to the residence that evening brought with it a quiet confrontation. She entered with subdued composure, aware of the public and private consequences that had been meticulously revealed throughout the day. Michael greeted her with calm authority, presenting the final documentation that formalized both legal and social acknowledgment of her actions. Her reaction was a mixture of shame, acknowledgment, and reluctant acceptance. The psychological impact was visible in her posture, the subtle tremor of hands, the fleeting avoidance of eye contact. Michael observed with controlled attention, understanding that these visible responses were the natural manifestation of accountability, the human recognition of consequence when the trap of evidence, strategy, and principle had fully taken effect. Michael allowed a measured silence to emphasize the gravity. "Beth," he said finally, voice even but firm, "the facts are undeniable. Responsibility has been acknowledged, and the corrective framework is now fully in place. How you proceed from here will determine the remainder of the consequences, both personal and professional." Beth nodded slowly, her expression reflecting a careful reconciliation of understanding and regret. I understand, Michael," she replied quietly, the words carrying both resignation and recognition of the inevitability of outcome. Michael maintained his composure, knowing that emotional impulses had no place in this resolution. The framework was deliberate, ethical, and protective. The child remained secure, the social and legal structures were intact, and the storm of betrayal had been transformed into a structured, enforceable reality. He reflected briefly on the nature of consequence, the delicate interplay between justice, human behavior, and strategic orchestration. Betrayal, hidden and corrosive, had been revealed, measured, and mitigated. The trap, patiently set and fully executed, had created an environment in which accountability was unavoidable and protection of the innocent absolute. The evening shadows lengthened as Michael returned to the quiet of the study. He allowed himself a moment of private acknowledgment, not satisfaction in vengeance, but in precision, clarity, and ethical fulfillment. Every step had been deliberate, psychological leverage, legal enforcement, and personal observation had converged to produce an outcome that was inevitable, transparent, and morally sound. Later, as Ethan prepared for bed, Michael observed him with a quiet attentiveness. The boy's security, untainted by the storm of adult consequence, remained intact. The home, though marked by the tension of past betrayal, had been stabilized. Michael allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, noting that justice had been enacted not through impulsivity, but through patience, strategy, and unwavering adherence to principle. The day concluded with a sense of cautious equilibrium. Andrew Vale had been confronted with the full extent of legal and social accountability. Beth had been made aware of the scope of consequence and acknowledgment. The Turner family, while having endured a profound emotional and ethical challenge, had emerged intact in terms of innocence, clarity, and protection. Michael allowed himself a final review of the evidence, documentation, and strategic notes. Every contingency had been anticipated, every variable accounted for, every possible deviation neutralized. The storm of betrayal had been transformed into a controlled, enforceable framework of consequence, leaving no room for ambiguity or evasion. As night enveloped the Turner residence, Michael Turner sat in quiet contemplation. The day's judgment, meticulously prepared and precisely executed, had reached its conclusion. Justice had been enacted through deliberate, ethical, and strategic means. The protection of innocence had been preserved. The orchestration of consequence had been fulfilled. For Michael, the true resolution was not the exposure or punishment of wrongdoing, but the transformation of chaos into clarity, deception into accountability, and potential devastation into controlled outcome. In the quiet of the night, the household rested under the calm assurance that accountability had been achieved, innocence preserved, and the path forward, while altered by consequence, was now clearly defined. Chapter 7: Immediate Consequences. The morning after Judgment Day dawned with an uneasy quiet, the kind that suggested a city holding its breath. Michael Turner, ever observant, sensed the subtle tremors of change, the faint echoes of events already set in motion. The legal actions, psychological confrontations, and formalized acknowledgments had left a mark on the world beyond his residence. The consequences were no longer theoretical, they were manifest, tangible, and unavoidable. Andrew Vale's office had been quiet for hours, the usual bustle replaced by a tense, nervous stillness. Word of the legal filings, corporate scrutiny, and professional oversight had spread quickly. Colleagues whispered in hallways, contracts were reviewed with sudden caution, and the board of directors convened with urgency. Every step Vale had taken, every decision he had made in the months prior, now bore the weight of accountability. The carefully constructed trap Michael had set was unfolding exactly as intended. Michael, seated in his study with a warm mug of coffee, reflected on the unfolding dynamics. There was no joy in watching the consequences, only the quiet satisfaction of precision and control. Betrayal, corrosive and hidden for so long, had been transformed into clarity, enforceable accountability, and social recognition of error. Every element of his strategy, the legal, the social, the psychological, had functioned with meticulous reliability. Meanwhile, Beth faced the reality of public and private acknowledgment. Friends and acquaintances, aware of the formal consequences and subtle social signals, began to withdraw. Invitations were rescinded, subtle remarks implied caution, and familiar circles of influence now regarded her with measured distance. The social fabric she had once navigated freely now reflected the outcomes of accountability, every relationship reshaped by recognition of her choices and their implications. Inside the Turner home, Michael observed Ethan, unaware of the full scope of adult maneuvering. The boy's innocence, his laughter, and his everyday routines provided a grounding rhythm in the midst of upheaval. Protecting him had been, and would remain, the guiding principle. No legal action, no public exposure, no orchestrated consequence could compromise the child's sense of safety. Michael had ensured this carefully, deliberately, and with unwavering focus. Corporate communication had begun to formalize as well. Andrew Vale's contracts were suspended, projects were reassigned, and regulatory bodies had initiated investigations into prior misrepresentations. Investors and partners, previously unaware of the intricacies of his actions, now re-evaluated their positions, prompted by the combination of legal acknowledgment and social consequence. The ripple effect was immediate and precise, exactly as Michael had anticipated. In the quiet of his office, Michael reflected on the interconnection of justice, accountability, and ethical precision. The storm of betrayal had been transformed into a structured reality, clear, enforceable, and morally sound. Vale's personal and professional networks were constrained, Beth's social position had shifted irreversibly, and the Turner household remained protected. Every piece had been aligned with the principles that had guided him from the first suspicion of betrayal to the execution of Judgment Day. Beth, confronted with tangible evidence and social isolation, experienced the psychological consequences in real time. Her reflection in the mirror revealed tension lines and subtle traces of anxiety, each a visible reminder of accountability's reach. She could no longer evade the consequences of her choices, no longer obscure the reality of betrayal, nor avoid the social, emotional, and legal impact that had been precisely calibrated by Michael's careful orchestration. By late morning, the city itself seemed to acknowledge the change. Business partners, legal professionals, and social networks adjusted their conduct in response to verified accountability. The immediate consequences of deception and misrepresentation manifested externally, while the Turner household observed in careful, controlled detachment. Michael understood that the culmination of months of patient orchestration had produced tangible, irreversible change. Ethan, blissfully unaware, moved through the day as if untouched by the storm surrounding him. Michael watched, feeling a profound, quiet satisfaction, not derived from retribution, but from the successful protection of innocence. The child's stability and continuity of experience remained intact, a testament to the guiding principle behind every meticulously executed action. Michael's mind revisited every stage of preparation, every detail of the trap, and every moment of psychological leverage. Each action, each document, each deliberate confrontation had served its purpose, to ensure clarity, accountability, and protection. The consequences, now visible and immediate, were proof of the efficacy of strategy, patience, and disciplined execution. As afternoon approached, Andrew Vale began to experience the compounded effects of public and professional scrutiny. Calls from partners became terse, emails requested clarification with suspicion, and the absence of informal allies highlighted the extent of isolation. The intricate web Michael had woven ensured that Vale's options were constrained, his autonomy curtailed, and his professional and personal credibility thoroughly undermined. Meanwhile, Beth retreated to a small, modest residence she had secured, aware of the permanent alteration of her social position. She engaged in reflection, remorse, and practical measures to stabilize her life. The public acknowledgment of her choices, combined with the private enforcement of accountability, left her with only the path of reconstruction and careful introspection. Michael, observing the unfolding consequences from his home, allowed himself a quiet, internal review. Each element, legal, social, psychological, had functioned exactly as intended. The storm of betrayal, once threatening to erode both family stability and moral clarity, had been transformed into a framework of enforceable consequence. Justice had been executed with precision, patience, and ethical integrity. As evening descended, the Turner household embraced a cautious calm. Ethan, free from awareness of the intricate orchestration, continued his routines with the natural resilience of youth. Michael allowed himself a private acknowledgement of success, not triumph in vengeance, but in clarity, protection, and ethical resolution. Every action had been deliberate, measured, and aligned with the guiding principle of preserving innocence while enforcing accountability. Michael reflected on the equilibrium now achieved: the consequences were public, legal, and social, the family remained intact in terms of emotional and psychological stability, and the perpetrators of betrayal faced irreversible acknowledgment. The delicate balance of patience, strategy, and principle had culminated in a tangible, controlled, and morally coherent reality. By nightfall, the immediate consequences had fully taken shape. Andrew Vale's professional network had adjusted, social credibility was diminished, and legal oversight remained firmly applied. Beth faced both social isolation and personal reflection, with the path forward defined by acknowledgement and reconstruction. The Turner household, while bearing the marks of scrutiny and preparation, remained a secure environment for the child and a foundation for measured, deliberate recovery. Michael allowed a final moment of introspection before retiring for the evening. The trap, fully executed, had converted betrayal and deception into enforceable, tangible consequence. The principles of justice, protection, and clarity had been applied with discipline and precision. The storm had passed, leaving a landscape of ethical resolution, social acknowledgement, and personal security. In the quiet of the night, Michael Turner reflected on the effectiveness of patience, strategy, and careful orchestration. The immediate consequences of Judgment Day had reshaped the professional, social, and personal realities of those involved. Yet the guiding principles remained unbroken: protection of innocence, enforcement of accountability, and preservation of clarity in the face of betrayal. As the days unfolded after the public revelation and legal enforcement, the Turner household gradually returned to a measured rhythm, a rhythm marked not by ignorance of the past but by deliberate reconstruction. Michael Turner, now acutely aware of the fragility and resilience of human relationships, focused his attention on the restoration of normalcy and emotional stability. Every decision, every small gesture, was guided by the imperative to protect Ethan while reinforcing the lessons of accountability. The boy remained unaware of the full scope of adult conflict, yet Michael observed subtle signs that he sensed change in the household. There were moments when Ethan would glance toward the study, curiosity etched across his youthful features, as if intuitively aware that something significant had occurred behind the closed doors. Michael met these glances with calm reassurance, a gentle reminder that the world he inhabited remained safe, predictable, and structured. The restoration process was not limited to emotional stability. Michael methodically revisited the company's operations, ensuring that every decision Vale had influenced, every project subject to manipulation or misrepresentation, was now corrected. Contracts were reviewed, internal audits conducted, and employees reassured. The transition, though complex, was deliberate. The goal was to establish a foundation of integrity, resilience, and transparency for the future. Ethan, with the natural curiosity and resilience of youth, gradually adapted to the new cadence of home life. Weekends became structured around quiet activities and routines that reinforced a sense of security. Michael introduced projects and small tasks that engaged the boy in meaningful ways: gardening, minor repairs around the house, and supervised exposure to company operations in a controlled, educational manner. Each activity was designed to instill confidence, curiosity, and a practical understanding of responsibility. Michael, while engaged in these routines, continued to reflect on the broader implications of the upheaval. The exposure of Vale's misdeeds, the social isolation of Beth, and the legal enforcement of accountability had demonstrated the intersection of ethics, law, and personal consequence. Yet the real victory, he reminded himself, was not punishment but preservation, safeguarding Ethan, ensuring the family's continuity, and modeling the disciplined application of principle. Evenings were a time of quiet reflection. Michael often sat with Ethan at the dinner table, discussing minor aspects of life, school, and the boy's observations about the world. These conversations, seemingly ordinary, were infused with a subtle reinforcement of ethical awareness. Responsibility, honesty, and foresight were introduced gently, contextualized within the framework of everyday experiences rather than overt lessons or lectures. The subtlety was intentional, ensuring that lessons were absorbed without burdening the child with adult anxiety. Michael also considered the social reconstruction. Friends and allies, once distant due to the ripple effects of betrayal and consequence, began to re-engage, cautiously and with measured curiosity. These interactions were carefully monitored, ensuring that the principles of accountability remained central while allowing the family to reclaim aspects of social normalcy. Trust, once fractured, was being rebuilt incrementally, guided by transparency, ethical clarity, and consistent demonstration of integrity. During the late afternoons, Michael often found himself in solitary reflection. The months of planning, the strategic orchestration, and the patient execution of Judgment Day remained vivid in his memory. Each decision had been deliberate, each action calculated to produce enforceable, ethical, and protective outcomes. The alignment of legal, social, and personal consequences had proven effective, yet he remained mindful that the long-term well-being of Ethan required continuous attention, empathy, and guidance. As the weeks progressed, Michael introduced structured routines to reinforce stability. Ethan's involvement in controlled, age-appropriate decision-making provided both engagement and a subtle understanding of responsibility. Household schedules, balanced with recreational activities, encouraged emotional regulation, practical skills, and the gradual internalization of principles Michael deemed essential. The home became both sanctuary and classroom, blending protection with education, and emotional security with experiential learning. Michael's reflections often returned to the concept of consequence. The deliberate orchestration of accountability had demonstrated the power of strategy, patience, and principle in transforming potential chaos into structured reality. Yet he also recognized the necessity of recovery, of providing space for reflection, emotional processing, and the subtle reconstruction of trust. The equilibrium between justice and restoration required constant attention, deliberate pacing, and deep engagement with both ethical and emotional dimensions. Beth, now removed from the immediate sphere of influence, continued her own process of reconstruction and reflection. The consequences imposed, both legal and social, had altered her trajectory. Michael observed from a distance, acknowledging the necessity of consequence while remaining focused on the immediate priority, the protection and emotional well-being of his son. Distance, both physical and psychological, allowed for natural processing of accountability while preventing further interference in the family's restoration. Through this period, Michael maintained a steady internal dialogue, constantly evaluating progress, anticipating potential disruptions, and reinforcing the structures he had established. The convergence of legal, social, and personal accountability had created a foundation, but sustained equilibrium required vigilance, patience, and intentionality. Each day, each interaction, each decision contributed incrementally to the restoration of stability and the reinforcement of principle. Evening reflections became a ritual of both gratitude and contemplation. Michael recognized the significance of measured patience, the efficacy of strategic foresight, and the ethical clarity that had guided his actions. Justice, carefully executed, had created tangible consequences without collateral damage to innocence. Protection of Ethan, restoration of operational integrity, and gradual social stabilization marked the tangible outcomes of deliberate, principled strategy. Michael allowed moments of quiet satisfaction, tempered by ongoing awareness of responsibility. The immediate consequences of Judgment Day had reshaped social, professional, and personal landscapes. Yet the real measure of success lay in the ongoing reconstruction of trust, emotional equilibrium, and the cultivation of a secure, predictable environment for Ethan. Every step taken, every principle reinforced, ensured that the family's future would be both resilient and ethically grounded. By late evening, the Turner household settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm defined by careful attention to emotional well-being, measured routines, and deliberate reinforcement of principle. Ethan, secure and curious, continued to thrive, his experience shaped not by the chaos of adult betrayal but by the deliberate protection and guidance provided by Michael. The intersection of consequence, protection, and ethical restoration had been navigated successfully, establishing a foundation for both continuity and growth. Michael reflected on the broader significance of these months of upheaval. The orchestration of accountability had transformed betrayal into tangible, enforceable outcomes. Yet, more importantly, it had reinforced the guiding principle that protection of innocence, patient application of principle, and ethical clarity were paramount. The immediate consequences, though profound, had been absorbed within a framework that prioritized stability, continuity, and moral coherence. As the household prepared for night, a quiet sense of equilibrium settled over the Turner residence. The lessons of accountability, consequence, and ethical navigation had been enacted. The framework for ongoing restoration, growth, and protection had been established. Michael Turner allowed himself a moment of reflection, acknowledging that justice had been served, innocence preserved, and the path forward, though altered by consequence, was now secure, structured, and ethically sound. By the third week after Judgment Day, the full spectrum of consequences had begun to settle into a grim, orderly reality. Beth, once socially prominent and accustomed to influence, had retreated into a quieter existence, the subtle shifts in social circles reflecting a permanent reordering. Invitations ceased, casual contacts became formal, and whispers of past behavior circulated quietly among acquaintances. Michael observed these shifts with measured detachment, understanding that the social consequences were an essential complement to the legal and professional ones. In the quiet of his study, Michael reflected on the nature of accountability. Consequence was not merely punitive, it was instructive, transformative, and protective. The social marginalization of Beth, while inevitable, was secondary to the preservation of Ethan's innocence and the re-establishment of ethical clarity within both the family and professional spheres. Each social withdrawal, each subtle distancing, reinforced the principles he had so carefully instilled through action and example. Ethan, increasingly aware of the subtle tensions in adult interactions yet shielded from their full complexity, continued to flourish. His intelligence, curiosity, and emerging sense of responsibility were nurtured through consistent, structured routines. Weekend projects, supervised exposure to aspects of the family business, and minor responsibilities around the household allowed him to internalize a sense of competence and ethical engagement. Michael observed these developments with quiet pride, aware that the child's growth and resilience were the most tangible measure of the careful orchestration he had undertaken. Meanwhile, Beth confronted her own reflection daily, both figuratively and literally. The domestic isolation and social distancing imposed by consequence forced introspection. Legal ramifications and public acknowledgment of her choices served as persistent reminders of accountability, leaving her with the dual task of reconstructing personal identity while processing ethical failure. Michael, from a distance, acknowledged the necessity of this process, recognizing that restoration required both consequence and reflection. In the professional realm, Andrew Vale's missteps continued to ripple outward. Partners reviewed contracts with heightened scrutiny, corporate engagements were suspended, and regulatory oversight tightened. Each action validated the strategy Michael had employed. The combination of evidence, formal acknowledgement, and methodical application of consequence created a self-reinforcing framework that ensured accountability was neither circumstantial nor reversible. At home, Michael focused on re-establishing stability and reinforcing the values of integrity and resilience. Dinner conversations with Ethan became opportunities for reflection and subtle guidance. Discussions about school, personal responsibility, and the importance of ethical decisions were woven seamlessly into everyday exchanges, reinforcing principles without overwhelming or frightening the child. The quiet, consistent presence of ethical modeling became a foundation for long-term character development. Evening routines were deliberately structured, balancing academic review, recreational activity, and reflection. Michael monitored not only the practical outcomes of these routines but also the emotional landscape they created. Ethan's laughter, curiosity, and natural energy became both a measure of ongoing stability and a reminder of the stakes involved, preserving innocence while navigating the consequences of adult actions. The broader social context continued to evolve. Mutual acquaintances, previously hesitant, gradually reassessed their perceptions of Michael and his family. Transparency, ethical consistency, and resilience created a counter-narrative to the chaos of betrayal, reinforcing social credibility and demonstrating that consequence could coexist with integrity. These subtle shifts, though imperceptible to many, were noted carefully by Michael, who understood that social perception was a persistent, evolving factor in the maintenance of long-term stability. Michael also devoted time to personal reflection and planning. The orchestration of Judgment Day, the careful management of legal and social consequences, and the ongoing protection of Ethan required constant vigilance. Every day offered new opportunities to reinforce ethical principles, correct deviations, and ensure that the structural equilibrium of the family remained intact. The process demanded patience, foresight, and meticulous attention to detail, qualities Michael had cultivated over decades of professional and personal experience. Beth's occasional inquiries, filtered through legal counsel, were met with calm, measured responses. Michael maintained boundaries that protected both Ethan and the family's integrity while allowing Beth limited engagement in matters directly related to her child. These interactions were deliberately structured to reinforce accountability and establish clear expectations without creating unnecessary emotional disruption. The cumulative effect of weeks of careful observation, structured routines, and ethical reinforcement became increasingly evident. Ethan demonstrated growing confidence, emotional regulation, and an intuitive understanding of responsibility. Socially, the Turner household maintained credibility and stability, while Beth and Andrew Vale experienced the persistent, inescapable consequences of past actions. The orchestration of Justice Day had matured into a sustainable framework, producing both immediate and enduring effects. Michael allowed himself brief moments of quiet satisfaction, tempered by the awareness that vigilance remained necessary. The deliberate application of principle had transformed potential chaos into predictable, manageable outcomes. Accountability, protection of innocence, and the gradual restoration of ethical equilibrium were the defining achievements of this period. As evening settled, Michael and Ethan shared a quiet ritual of reflection and preparation for the next day. The boys' world, though marked by the faint shadows of adult complexity, remained safe, structured, and comprehensible. The lessons of integrity, responsibility, and consequence were embedded subtly yet persistently within daily life, ensuring that the child's development was nurtured even amidst the aftermath of profound upheaval. In the solitude of the night, Michael reflected on the overarching significance of these weeks. Betrayal, once hidden and corrosive, had been addressed with precision, patience, and ethical clarity. Consequences had been enacted across legal, social, and personal domains, and the family's structure had been preserved. Innocence had been protected, ethical clarity reinforced, and the path forward, though irrevocably altered, remained secure, structured, and morally coherent. The Turner household, now settled into a cautious but steady rhythm, embodied both the results of deliberate action and the ongoing commitment to principle. The orchestration of accountability, while executed in a controlled and measured manner, had tangible, enduring effects. Michael recognized that true resolution was not measured solely by punishment, but by the sustained restoration of integrity, stability, and ethical equilibrium. By the end of the third week, the household had transitioned into a new equilibrium. The immediate consequences of Judgment Day had solidified into enduring patterns, shaping behavior, reinforcing principles, and preserving innocence. Michael Turner, in quiet contemplation, acknowledged the success of a carefully executed strategy that balanced justice, protection, and restoration. Chapter 8: Rebuilding. By the spring of 2006, the city had changed, and so had Michael Turner. The months of meticulous orchestration, accountability, and quiet reconstruction had yielded a foundation upon which he could cautiously rebuild both professional and personal life. His company, Turner Apparel, now expanded into the international market, reflecting the integrity, precision, and reliability that had guided him through months of upheaval. Michael often walked through the factory floor, observing employees as they worked with diligence and pride. The atmosphere had transformed, morale was high, not because of superficial incentives, but because the foundation of trust, fairness, and accountability had been firmly re-established. Employees understood that excellence, responsibility, and ethical conduct were not only expected but supported. Michael's presence, steady and observant, reminded them of both the past challenges and the lessons that had emerged from them. Ethan, now approaching 18, had become an active participant in the household and a thoughtful observer of his father's work. Weekend visits to the factory had evolved into guided introductions to business operations, discussions of decision-making, and gentle exposure to financial and ethical considerations. Michael took care not to burden Ethan with undue responsibility, but allowed him a perspective that fostered confidence, understanding, and critical thinking. Personal life had also begun to shift. Michael had met Laura Hastings, a schoolteacher known for her steady kindness, gentle humor, and authenticity. Their initial meetings were unhurried, each interaction grounded in shared values rather than superficial attraction. Laura, older than many teachers he had known, carried with her a sense of calm, groundedness, and resilience that resonated with Michael's own carefully measured approach to life. Dinner conversations with Laura were marked by subtle revelations, mutual reflection, and quiet laughter. Michael found himself appreciating the slow development of trust, the absence of artifice, and the natural pacing of a relationship built on mutual respect and integrity. Ethan observed cautiously at first, but gradually came to recognize Laura as a stabilizing presence, someone who could enrich their lives without disrupting the careful equilibrium Michael had worked to maintain. In the evenings, Michael would review company operations, correspondence, and long-term strategic plans. Each decision reflected the lessons learned during the upheaval: transparency, ethical foresight, and meticulous attention to consequence. Expanding into new markets, refining operational procedures, and nurturing employee development were no longer just professional ambitions, they were acts of restoring integrity to a world that had once threatened to unravel. Ethan, increasingly independent and thoughtful, often joined his father in these reviews, asking questions about contracts, production cycles, and the impact of ethical business practices. Michael responded with patience, grounding explanations in practical examples, illustrating principles without overburdening the young man with adult anxieties. The household rhythm, structured yet flexible, allowed for both personal growth and familial stability. Even weekends, once consumed with leisure or casual oversight, now included deliberate engagement with the local community. Michael and Ethan participated in volunteer programs, modest charity events, and occasional mentorship initiatives, fostering a sense of ethical responsibility and civic awareness. These actions were not motivated by social recognition but by a genuine desire to reinforce principles of service, integrity, and reflection in both father and son. Laura's presence further enriched the household dynamic. She introduced gentle routines, shared reflective conversations with Ethan, and provided a steady emotional balance that complemented Michael's structured focus. Their interactions were unhurried, marked by authenticity rather than performance, offering a model of mature, grounded relational dynamics. Michael, who had once believed the complexities of betrayal might preclude future trust, found himself appreciating the quiet security and mutual respect that defined this new chapter. The Turner residence, once tense and defined by shadows of conflict, had evolved into a home of careful equilibrium. Spaces previously charged with anticipation or anxiety now held calm, reflective energy. Ethan's laughter, Laura's gentle presence, and Michael's attentive engagement combined to create a rhythm that balanced professional vigilance with personal stability. The home became both sanctuary and laboratory for practical life lessons, ethical modeling, and emotional resilience. Michael reflected frequently on the delicate interplay between consequence and restoration. The orchestration of Judgment Day, the meticulous oversight of professional and personal domains, and the patient nurturing of both company and family had culminated in a sustainable framework. Mistakes of the past were acknowledged, consequences enacted, and the path forward built on transparency, trust, and deliberate care. In moments of quiet reflection, Michael acknowledged the duality of rebuilding, the necessity of vigilance and the capacity for renewal. Professional recovery, ethical reinforcement, and the cultivation of personal relationships were intertwined processes, requiring both strategic foresight and emotional intelligence. Michael's experience underscored the importance of deliberate pacing, the integration of principle into daily life, and the careful monitoring of both immediate and long-term effects. Ethan, observing these patterns, began to internalize the values that had guided the family through turbulence. He learned that accountability was inseparable from trust, that consequence and restoration were partners rather than adversaries, and that ethical clarity could coexist with personal growth. These lessons, absorbed through observation and participation, reinforced both his independence and his understanding of the world. Professional growth continued to align with ethical principles. Michael's decision-making incorporated lessons from prior upheavals, transparency in contracts, clear communication with partners, and ethical oversight in production. Expansion into international markets required careful planning, yet the foundation of trust and accountability ensured that risks were managed prudently. Every step reflected the deliberate philosophy that had guided him through months of challenge and consequence. As the year progressed, the Turner household achieved a rhythm of stability and quiet achievement. Ethan prepared for university, guided by both academic ambition and moral grounding. Michael continued to expand Turner Apparel responsibly, balancing innovation with ethical oversight. Laura's integration into the household provided warmth, consistency, and a model of grounded relational integrity. The combination of professional vigilance, personal reflection, and careful nurturing created a sustainable, resilient framework for life. In quiet moments, Michael reflected on the profound lessons of the past years. Betrayal, consequence, accountability, and restoration were not isolated events but interwoven elements of a life governed by principle. The orchestration of justice, the patient cultivation of ethical clarity, and the protection of innocence had created a path forward, both secure and meaningful. Evenings in the Turner household became a sanctuary of reflection, learning, and connection. Conversations with Ethan and Laura reinforced principles without imposing anxiety, creating an environment in which responsibility, integrity, and emotional resilience could flourish. The home had become a living testament to the careful integration of consequence, ethical practice, and personal growth. Michael, observing the interplay of professional accomplishment, familial stability, and relational trust, recognized the value of deliberate reconstruction. Life, once threatened by betrayal and deception, had been carefully realigned, providing a foundation upon which growth, joy, and measured love could emerge. The rebuilding was neither swift nor superficial, it was deep, deliberate, and enduring. In this renewed chapter, Michael Turner found not only stability but a sense of quiet fulfillment. The company thrived ethically, Ethan matured with awareness and confidence, and Laura provided relational security and warmth. The past, while acknowledged, no longer defined the present. It had become a framework for understanding, ethical vigilance, and careful cultivation of future possibilities. As night fell over the Turner residence, Michael observed the household's calm energy. The rhythm of life, structured, deliberate, and reflective, affirmed that rebuilding was more than recovery, it was transformation. Ethical clarity, personal growth, and the protection of innocence had produced a sustainable equilibrium, a foundation for enduring stability and quiet fulfillment. The weeks that followed the formal restoration of the Turner household were marked by a rhythm of subtle stability. Michael had learned that rebuilding was never a singular act, it was a process of persistent attention, small adjustments, and deliberate reinforcement of principle. Each day unfolded with careful deliberation, Ethan's routines, the company's operational oversight, and the cultivation of personal relationships all integrated into a cohesive structure. Ethan, now increasingly independent and perceptive, displayed the quiet confidence that had been nurtured through months of deliberate guidance. He began to take ownership of small projects at Turner Apparel, from reviewing inventory reports to participating in ethical discussions about labor practices. Michael observed his son with measured pride, aware that the lessons of accountability, consequence, and integrity were internalized through practical experience as much as conversation. Laura, integrated into this carefully structured household, became both partner and guide. Her influence was subtle but profound, shaping the domestic environment with warmth and consistency. She organized routines that balanced study, recreation, and reflection, creating spaces in which Ethan could thrive emotionally and intellectually. Her presence was a stabilizing counterpoint to Michael's methodical vigilance, and he came to appreciate the gentle equilibrium she brought to daily life. Michael's reflections often returned to the delicate balance between protection and empowerment. The months of upheaval had underscored the fragility of trust and the necessity of foresight. Yet, he realized that overprotection could hinder growth. With Laura's guidance, he allowed Ethan greater autonomy within structured limits, encouraging problem-solving, decision-making, and ethical reflection. These opportunities, though carefully monitored, reinforced both competence and confidence. Professional expansion continued alongside domestic consolidation. Michael negotiated new contracts with international partners, emphasizing transparency, ethical labor practices, and quality control. Each step was deliberate, with calculated risk balanced by careful oversight. The company, once threatened by external manipulation and internal uncertainty, now operated as a model of integrity and strategic foresight. Employees responded positively, inspired by both the tangible outcomes of ethical business practices and the stability of leadership. Evening conversations became a ritual of reflection and subtle instruction. Michael, Laura, and Ethan discussed events of the day, considered hypothetical scenarios, and explored moral and practical decision-making. These discussions, though casual in tone, were deliberate in content. They reinforced the ethical and strategic lessons Michael had deemed essential, while fostering a sense of engagement, curiosity, and critical thinking in Ethan. The domestic atmosphere, previously charged with tension, had evolved into one of deliberate calm. Every space, every routine, every interaction was subtly infused with the principles of accountability, integrity, and thoughtful engagement. Michael observed these transformations with quiet satisfaction, recognizing that the deliberate integration of principle into daily life was producing a sustainable equilibrium. In moments of solitude, Michael reflected on the interplay between past consequences and present reconstruction. Betrayal and upheaval had been transformed into opportunity and growth. The meticulous orchestration of Judgment Day, the patient cultivation of accountability, and the ongoing reinforcement of ethical principles had produced a framework that was both resilient and adaptable. He understood that stability required ongoing attention, and that the past could never be entirely forgotten but could serve as a foundation for informed decision-making. Ethan, increasingly aware of subtle dynamics in adult relationships, observed Michael and Laura with curiosity and developing discernment. He began to understand the nuances of trust, responsibility, and emotional intelligence. Michael encouraged questions and reflections, ensuring that lessons were absorbed without burdening the child with unnecessary anxiety. The interplay of guidance, observation, and practical involvement created an environment in which maturity and ethical awareness could flourish naturally. Community engagement, previously limited by upheaval and reconstruction, became a subtle but consistent part of daily life. Michael and Laura introduced Ethan to local initiatives, mentoring younger students, participating in community service, and observing civic responsibility in action. These experiences reinforced the practical application of ethical principles, providing context for lessons learned within the household and ensuring that moral development extended beyond domestic boundaries. Michael continued to integrate reflective routines into his personal and professional life. Morning walks, deliberate planning sessions, and private contemplation allowed him to assess progress, anticipate potential challenges, and adjust strategies as needed. Each action, though seemingly mundane, contributed to the preservation of stability, ethical consistency, and long-term resilience for both family and company. As the weeks progressed, subtle but meaningful indicators of growth emerged. Ethan demonstrated increasing confidence in decision-making, awareness of ethical considerations, and the ability to navigate social and professional situations with insight. Laura's steady presence reinforced emotional resilience, providing guidance without overstepping boundaries. Michael observed these developments with a sense of quiet validation, recognizing that the deliberate cultivation of principle and stability was producing tangible outcomes. Evenings remained a time of shared reflection and measured conversation. Michael, Laura, and Ethan discussed events, considered moral dilemmas, and explored practical solutions to hypothetical challenges. These interactions, structured yet informal, reinforced the ethical framework that Michael had carefully established, fostering critical thinking, empathy, and situational awareness in Ethan. The professional realm continued to reflect the lessons of past upheavals. Turner Apparel expanded cautiously but decisively into new markets, emphasizing sustainable practices, ethical sourcing, and transparent communication with partners. Michael's experience with deception and betrayal had informed every negotiation, contract, and decision, ensuring that risk was balanced by oversight and principle. Employees, inspired by consistent leadership and ethical clarity, embraced the culture of accountability and excellence. Michael reflected frequently on the delicate balance of reconstruction, maintaining vigilance without creating rigidity, nurturing growth without fostering dependence, and reinforcing principle without imposing fear. This balance, achieved through careful observation and deliberate adjustment, ensured that the household and company could thrive simultaneously, even in the face of past adversity. Ethan's maturation became increasingly evident. He exhibited thoughtful engagement with schoolwork, practical involvement in family operations, and a developing sense of responsibility toward both household and community. Michael encouraged reflection, discussion, and practical problem-solving, guiding the boy through experiences that nurtured both competence and ethical awareness. Each day reinforced the lessons learned through consequence, recovery, and deliberate cultivation of character. As the season shifted, the Turner household embraced a rhythm of quiet stability. Morning routines, work obligations, and educational engagements were interwoven seamlessly with periods of reflection, recreation, and relational interaction. The integration of ethical principle, measured oversight, and personal growth created an environment in which resilience and adaptability could thrive. Michael often paused to reflect on the broader trajectory of the family and company. The months of upheaval, betrayal, and consequence had been arduous, yet they had produced an opportunity for deliberate reconstruction. Ethical clarity, emotional resilience, and structural stability had been established, creating a foundation for sustainable growth and personal fulfillment. Evenings were a time for quiet acknowledgment of progress. Michael observed Ethan's engagement, Laura's steady presence, and the growing stability of both household and professional operations. The lessons of past consequences were internalized and integrated, providing both guidance and reassurance. The deliberate application of principle, combined with patient nurturing and ethical modeling, had transformed a period of crisis into a framework for enduring equilibrium. By the end of this section, the Turner household had established a sustainable rhythm. The convergence of professional recovery, personal growth, and relational trust reflected the culmination of months of patient effort. Michael Turner, observing the ongoing development of Ethan, the steady presence of Laura, and the ethical foundation of the company, allowed himself a quiet recognition: rebuilding was neither fleeting nor superficial, it was deliberate, principled, and enduring. By late 2006, the Turner household had settled into a rhythm of quiet achievement. Michael had learned that rebuilding was not a singular act but a continuum of careful choices, consistent ethical practice, and deliberate attention to both professional and personal spheres. Each day presented subtle challenges, yet these were met with a combination of foresight, patience, and measured judgment. Turner Apparel, having expanded into international markets, now operated with a stability and reputation that reflected Michael's dedication to principle. Partners trusted the company not merely for its products but for its integrity. Contracts were executed transparently, production practices adhered strictly to ethical standards, and employees were engaged with a sense of shared responsibility. Michael's earlier experiences had instilled in him a vigilance that balanced growth with caution, ensuring that expansion never came at the expense of principle. Ethan, now on the threshold of adulthood, had internalized the lessons of accountability and consequence. His participation in the company's operations, while supervised and age-appropriate, had instilled confidence and discernment. He navigated decisions with a thoughtful combination of caution and curiosity, reflecting both his father's influence and his own growing moral awareness. Michael observed these developments with quiet pride, understanding that the real measure of success lay not only in professional achievements but in the cultivation of character and judgment. Laura's presence remained a source of calm and consistency. Her integration into the household provided balance, emotional grounding, and relational stability. Michael appreciated the way she encouraged dialogue, fostered reflection, and modeled empathy. Their relationship, slow and deliberate, was built on mutual respect rather than passion alone. The household, structured around shared values, had become a space of both security and growth. Weekends, previously dominated by routine oversight or logistical concerns, were now opportunities for intentional connection. Michael, Laura, and Ethan engaged in reflective conversation, leisurely outdoor activities, and community service. These moments, while ordinary in appearance, were rich in significance. They reinforced lessons of responsibility, integrity, and empathy while providing a sanctuary of relational trust. In professional matters, Michael continued to exercise measured oversight. Strategic expansion into new markets required careful assessment of risk, partner reliability, and operational feasibility. Each step reflected lessons learned from past upheavals. Transparency, accountability, and ethical foresight were non-negotiable principles. Employees, aware of both the company's history and its renewed ethical foundation, embraced their roles with commitment and pride. Michael often spent evenings in reflection, contemplating the delicate interplay of consequence, reconstruction, and ongoing vigilance. The months of upheaval had taught him that stability was neither accidental nor permanent, it required continuous, deliberate effort. Every decision, interaction, and action contributed to the maintenance of equilibrium, both within the family and in professional domains. Ethan, increasingly perceptive and thoughtful, participated in these reflections in subtle ways. His questions, observations, and occasional suggestions demonstrated growing maturity and ethical awareness. Michael encouraged this engagement, using practical examples to illustrate the application of principle in both personal and professional contexts. Through this process, the boy internalized lessons of consequence, responsibility, and strategic foresight without the burden of adult anxiety. Laura's contributions extended beyond emotional support. She facilitated routines that encouraged independent thought, reflection, and measured risk-taking. Her presence complemented Michael's vigilance, allowing for a balanced environment in which both professional and personal growth could coexist. Ethan, observing and learning, gained confidence in navigating complex situations, understanding both principle and nuance. The household's rhythms reflected a balance of work, study, recreation, and reflection. Meals were shared with attention to dialogue, reflection, and relational connection. Weekdays involved structured learning and professional involvement, while weekends blended leisurely engagement with purposeful reflection. The integration of ethical principles into daily life reinforced stability and created an environment in which growth could occur organically. Community engagement became an integral aspect of the household's evolution. Michael and Laura introduced Ethan to civic participation, mentoring, and modest charitable initiatives. These experiences contextualized ethical lessons, providing practical examples of responsibility, empathy, and engagement with broader societal structures. The family's involvement was not performative but deliberate, emphasizing reflection and principle in action. Professional success continued to align with ethical priorities. Turner Apparel's international expansion was methodical, deliberate, and transparent. Contracts were executed with clarity, labor practices adhered strictly to standards, and communication with partners emphasized trust and mutual accountability. Michael's vigilance, tempered by experience, ensured that growth was sustainable, ethically sound, and consistent with long-term goals. Evening reflections often included contemplations on past events. Michael considered the orchestration of Judgment Day, the deliberate reconstruction of family and company, and the ongoing cultivation of ethical clarity. These reflections were not indulgent but purposeful, providing guidance for future decisions and reinforcing principles that had proven effective. Ethan, increasingly aware of subtleties in human behavior and social dynamics, began to demonstrate both discretion and moral discernment. Michael encouraged these qualities, reinforcing the importance of observation, reflection, and principled action. The household, through deliberate structure and engagement, had become a space of ethical education, personal growth, and relational trust. Laura's integration into daily life remained both subtle and profound. She facilitated dialogue, fostered reflection, and modeled patience. Her presence reinforced emotional stability while complementing Michael's measured vigilance. The interplay between professional oversight, personal growth, and relational guidance created a holistic environment in which resilience, integrity, and thoughtful engagement could flourish. As the year progressed, Michael observed the tangible outcomes of careful reconstruction. Ethan's growth, the company's stability, and the household's equilibrium reflected the success of deliberate, principled action. The orchestration of consequence, restoration, and ethical modeling had created a framework capable of sustaining both personal and professional growth. Evenings were often quiet, reflective, and deliberate. Michael observed Ethan's engagement with study, reflection, and practical involvement, noting the development of independence, moral awareness, and thoughtful judgment. Laura's calm presence reinforced this growth, providing consistency and relational security. The household's rhythms, deliberate and structured, were both protective and enabling, fostering resilience, competence, and ethical awareness. In these months, Michael realized that rebuilding was more than restoration, it was transformation. Professional success was intertwined with ethical practice, personal relationships were nurtured through trust, consistency, and reflection. Ethan's development embodied the lessons of consequence and accountability, and the household's equilibrium was both a product and reinforcement of these principles. By late 2006, the Turner household had achieved a stable, deliberate rhythm. Professional operations were secure and principled, Ethan had matured in awareness and competence, and Michael's personal life with Laura provided warmth, guidance, and relational stability. The past, acknowledged and integrated, informed decisions but no longer dictated outcomes. Ethical clarity, strategic foresight, and emotional balance formed the foundation of enduring success. Michael Turner, observing the household's calm energy, reflected on the profound lessons of the past years. Betrayal had been addressed, consequences enacted, and reconstruction achieved with both patience and principle. The family's equilibrium, professional integrity, and ethical modeling created a framework capable of sustaining growth, stability, and fulfillment well into the future. Chapter 9, Justice Served. By the spring of 2008, the Turner story had become something of a local legend, a measured, instructive tale whispered among business circles and social acquaintances alike. Michael often reflected on how the months of upheaval, betrayal, and deliberate orchestration had crystallized into a framework of enduring stability. The lessons of consequence and restoration had not only preserved the family's integrity but had redefined it in the public consciousness. Ethan, now a young adult preparing for university, had absorbed the subtle lessons of the past, accountability, foresight, and ethical clarity. He moved with a quiet confidence that belied his age, demonstrating an understanding of nuance in relationships, responsibility, and decision-making. Michael observed him with a mixture of pride and cautious admiration, mindful that adulthood would continue to present unforeseen challenges. Yet he also recognized that Ethan had been fortified, mentally and morally, by the carefully structured household and deliberate modeling he had received. Beth, by contrast, existed on the periphery of the city's social fabric. The months following Judgment Day had imposed consequences that were both public and private. Former acquaintances, once casual allies, now maintained polite but distant relations. Invitations ceased, opportunities dwindled, and whispers of past indiscretions lingered in subtle but persistent ways. Her own reflection, literal and figurative, confronted her with choices she could no longer reverse. Legal and social accountability had become inseparable, creating a reality she could not evade. From a distance, Michael observed these developments with a detached empathy. Consequence, he understood, was neither cruelty nor revenge, it was an extension of principle, an instrument of clarity, and a measure of protection for those who had been wronged. While Beth's isolation was regrettable in human terms, it was also instructive. The transparency of past actions had produced a natural, inescapable result. Michael's reflections on justice emphasized this distinction between punishment and consequence, recognizing that true equilibrium emerged not from vengeance but from the natural unfolding of accountability. Turner Apparel continued its deliberate expansion, guided by ethical principle and professional foresight. Contracts, international partnerships, and operational strategies reflected both ambition and moral rigor. Employees, long familiar with the lessons of transparency and ethical accountability, engaged with renewed confidence, understanding that the company's integrity was as much a part of its value as its tangible products. Michael's oversight remained measured and deliberate, balancing growth with vigilant adherence to principle. Evenings in the Turner household had become reflective rituals, infused with purpose rather than anxiety. Discussions with Ethan and Laura covered practical matters, moral dilemmas, and observations of social dynamics. Michael encouraged participation, critical thinking, and ethical reasoning, understanding that these interactions were foundational to both character development and relational cohesion. The household had evolved into a living laboratory of integrity, resilience, and moral clarity. In private moments, Michael considered the broader implications of past events. The orchestration of Judgment Day, the methodical reconstruction of both family and company, and the deliberate nurturing of ethical clarity had created a sustainable framework for life. Past chaos had been transmuted into structure, betrayal into vigilance, and consequence into teaching. These reflections reinforced the understanding that principle, when applied consistently and patiently, could produce enduring equilibrium. Ethan, increasingly capable of self-reflection, demonstrated both discernment and moral awareness. His engagement in household decision-making, community involvement, and academic planning reflected lessons absorbed from observation, discussion, and guided participation. Michael recognized that the child's growth, intellectual, emotional, and ethical, was a testament to the sustained application of principle and the careful integration of consequence and restoration. Laura's influence, steady and measured, provided emotional consistency, guidance, and a model of thoughtful engagement. Her presence reinforced the values Michael sought to instill, offering warmth without compromising ethical clarity. Together, the family had achieved a balance in which stability, growth, and relational trust could coexist. Michael also continued to reflect on the lessons of accountability beyond the household. Partners, clients, and acquaintances observed Turner Apparel's ethical rigor, reliability, and transparency. The company's reputation, carefully rebuilt through patient oversight, ethical conduct, and practical demonstration of principle, now stood as a model of integrity within the wider business community. These observations reinforced Michael's belief in the enduring value of deliberate ethical practice. Consequence and principle, when applied thoughtfully, produced sustainable respect and trust. Beth, in contrast, navigated a markedly different landscape. Social estrangement, professional limitation, and the ongoing awareness of past mistakes underscored the persistent consequences of choice. Legal settlements, custody arrangements, and public awareness created a reality in which avoidance was no longer possible. Michael, observing from a distance, recognized that this outcome, while socially and emotionally significant, was also necessary. The equilibrium of his household and the protection of Ethan required that past actions be acknowledged and integrated into lasting consequence. Even within the household, subtle moments served as reinforcement of principle. Ethan, witnessing the outcomes of past betrayal and the deliberate management of consequence, internalized lessons of foresight, discernment, and ethical engagement. These lessons, absorbed organically rather than imposed through authority, became foundational to his emerging adulthood. Michael understood that the child's awareness of both consequence and restoration was integral to his moral and emotional development. Turner Apparel's continued expansion into international markets reflected a synthesis of ambition and ethical clarity. Every negotiation, partnership, and operational decision was evaluated through the lens of transparency and accountability. Michael's oversight, informed by experience and reflection, ensured that growth remained principled, sustainable, and resilient. Employees, recognizing both the lessons of the past and the stability of present practice, demonstrated dedication, pride, and conscientious engagement. Evenings remained a period of quiet reflection, conversation, and reinforcement of household principles. Michael, Laura, and Ethan discussed practical challenges, hypothetical scenarios, and ethical dilemmas, fostering insight, discernment, and critical reasoning. These routines, deliberately cultivated, reinforced both moral awareness and relational stability, ensuring that the household functioned as both sanctuary and laboratory of ethical principle. The months of 2008 confirmed the durability of reconstruction. The Turner household had evolved from crisis to equilibrium, professional operations had expanded responsibly, and ethical clarity had become both guiding principle and lived reality. Michael Turner reflected on these months with quiet satisfaction, aware that deliberate attention, measured consequence, and patient nurturing had produced outcomes far beyond mere survival. They had created a foundation for enduring integrity, stability, and fulfillment. Ethan, preparing to transition into university life, embodied the lessons carefully cultivated over the preceding years. Confidence, discernment, ethical awareness, and emotional resilience were evident in both his decisions and his demeanor. Michael observed these developments with a mixture of pride and cautious optimism, recognizing that adulthood would continue to challenge but also reward the values so deliberately instilled. In social terms, the Turner household had reclaimed both credibility and respect. Transparency, ethical consistency, and resilience had produced recognition not through force or performance but through quiet demonstration of principle. Observers noted the measured success of the family, the stability of their operations, and the evident integrity in both personal and professional life. Michael understood that this was the culmination of months of careful orchestration, patient rebuilding, and deliberate cultivation of moral and practical clarity. In private reflection, Michael acknowledged the final lesson of the past years: justice is not merely punitive. True equilibrium arises from the consistent application of principle, the thoughtful management of consequence, and the deliberate cultivation of stability. Betrayal, upheaval, and chaos, when addressed through measured action and ethical foresight, become opportunities for transformation and enduring growth. Evenings in the Turner household reflected this realization. Shared reflection, thoughtful conversation, and measured engagement reinforced ethical principles, nurtured growth, and maintained relational stability. The household had become both sanctuary and model, a space in which consequence and restoration coexisted, ethical clarity guided action, and resilience was cultivated through deliberate practice. By the end of 2008, the Turner family had achieved a state of sustainable equilibrium. Professional expansion, personal growth, and relational trust converged to create a framework capable of sustaining both immediate and long-term stability. Michael, observing Ethan's development, Laura's integration, and the ethical foundation of the company, allowed himself a quiet acknowledgment: justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through consequence, clarity, and the deliberate orchestration of principle. Michael Turner, standing at the threshold of his family's new chapter, recognized that the lessons of past betrayal had been transformed into enduring wisdom. Accountability, foresight, and ethical clarity had shaped not only the household but also the broader social and professional context. Justice had been enacted, not as spectacle, but as lived principle, producing both restoration and resilience.